Hello and welcome to Heroic Media. I'm Michelle Bauman.
And I'm Patrick Cordova.
This week on Heroic Media, one woman shares her experience of being married to a porn addict.
Pro-life pregnancy centers urge Google and Yahoo to be neutral in their advertising policies.
And finally, we'll highlight the arguments in the debate over embryo adoption.
Stay tuned for all these stories and more here on Heroic Media. So here at Heroic Media, we explore news headlines that deal with a lot of issues surrounding family, marriage, and life. And a lot of these issues, they're very foundational, a lot of moral issues involved in the stories we talk about.
Exactly, and these stories, they tend to revolve around abortion, euthanasia, embryonic stem cell research, human cloning, and homosexual marriage.
Exactly. So what's our first story this episode?
Thanks, Patrick. First up for today, in an anonymous letter, one woman admits to the heart-wrenching struggles of being married to a man addicted to pornography.
Man, this letter that apparently some woman wrote to her parish priest, this anonymous letter, and it just really detailed how she felt in her marriage and towards her children and towards her husband, and it related everything to her husband's addiction to pornography and how her addiction, or his addiction to pornography, had completely just destroyed these family relationships. And what was your reaction?
Absolutely. I think, pornography and addiction to pornography is something that we don't hear about enough.
Right.
But even when we do, it's very rare for us to hear about the woman's side of it, the wife's side of it. And this is something that I was really shocked and really sad to see what she was saying, her anger, her inability to forgive, her revengeful spending.
Yep.
And you can see the struggle because this is a woman who wants to live a Catholic life, and she's trying to do this, and her husband has admitted to her that he struggles with this. And so they're both trying, and they both have this desire to live the way that they're supposed to be, and yet they're falling short, and it is just devastating to her.
Right.
And just the idea that she's struggling, she's committing revenge against him by going on these spending sprees and all these things. The anger that she has, her inability to forgive. Right. That's what really struck me, I think.
Yeah, absolutely. Me too. Because she felt, she needed some sort of escape somehow, some sort of release. And that's how she did it, was in the form of revenge. And I know, couples that couples that have cheated on each other before, married couples. And it's extremely difficult on that relationship. And especially, and what struck me about this is that his addiction to pornography was exactly how couples feel that I know when their spouse has cheated on them. And so it's just amazing because that's how strong that bond of pornography is.
Absolutely.
And really what stood out to me also was just how she said she felt ashamed and she felt duped. She didn't feel like she was worth anything. And that's what pornography does, because to men, it makes this fantasy land in their mind. And that fantasy land, obviously it's fantasy, it's not anywhere near reality, right?
Right.
And it sets this crazy standard and all these crazy things that are not gonna happen, that are not true. And it just makes it impossible for a wife to be appreciated and loved.
Absolutely. And she even said, one of the quotes that I thought was so powerful, she said, "I have come to believe that an affair would actually have been easier to tolerate. For perhaps I could compete with flesh and bones, but not with this." So like you said, this is an impossible standard. We're talking about something that's not real life, just in the way that Photoshop is not real. It's creating this false expectation. This is the same kind of thing.
Yeah.
And so she can never live up to these standards, and he keeps falling back into it again and again. And it's completely destroying her own sense of self-worth and dignity.
Right. And she hinted at, and I think just speaking from a man's perspective, that I know plenty of men who are addicted to pornography or who have been addicted, and it does affect people. And this is a prime example. And as men, I think that we need to, the first thing you have to do is admit you have a problem.
Absolutely.
And, and then you have to figure out a way to break those bonds of that sin. And so it sounded like she discovered that he was addicted to pornography, and it was kind of a surprise to him because he didn't know that she knew. But then once he knew that she knew, it was this assumption that it would be easier for him to break the habit,
right.
But then it wasn't. And I think that you really have to rely on the grace of God. And
Absolutely.
It's just, those habits are so hard to break. And there's been connections or scientific studies that show these strong, powerful connections in the brain. And it's a true addiction. It's very difficult to overcome.
Absolutely. I think that's important to recognize that this is an addiction.
Right.
And like any other addiction, you can't always overcome it with just willpower. There was actually a really interesting study from Cambridge University last year. It found that the brain activity of compulsive pornography users reacted in the same way as drug addicts and alcohol addicts when they were exposed to those substances. It was the same area of the brain lighting up. So we're talking about an actual addiction here.
Yeah.
There was also an article in GQ last year that said 1 in 5 regular porn watchers say they feel controlled by their sexual desires.
Right.
So this is a very serious addiction. You need to be acknowledging it. You need to be getting sometimes professional help and really relying on the grace of God.
Absolutely. It's such a strong, powerful addiction, and I'm glad you referenced that. And I think that it's highlighted in her story, this anonymous woman's letter. She says that one of her friends, whose husband is also struggling with pornography addiction, she said, I wish my husband would be addicted to drugs instead of pornography. Like, that's how strong of a connection it is. And we really have to, I think, from a Christian perspective especially, we have to pay attention to what Jesus said. Because a lot of guys that I know will be like, well, it doesn't hurt to look, right? There's this idea that it doesn't hurt anybody to look at anything, right? And so, but what Jesus told us is that, if you look at a woman lustfully, which is what you're doing when you're looking at pornography, then you've already committed adultery with this person in your heart. So he rose the standard of what people were to be expected to do.
Absolutely.
And so I think we have to remember that really it's a transformation of heart too, and it affects us deeply and messes up our families.
Right. Absolutely. And I would just like to add, if any of our viewers know someone who is maybe struggling with pornography, there are resources out there. ReclaimSexualHealth.com, that's the website for a group that actually works with the neuroscience of addiction and tries to help people overcome, sort of rewire their brain and these kind of issues. So
that's
great.
A resource. Good resource for people wanting to change.
Right, absolutely.
Good stuff. All right, in our next story, a recent Washington Post article claimed that Google had removed some pro-life crisis pregnancy center advertisements after NARAL had complained that the ads were deceptive. So this is a kind of interesting development how this is going. So NARAL, Pro-Choice America, is obviously a pro-abortion organization.
Right.
They're heavily funded by a lot of deep pockets. And so their whole goal is to go out and spread awareness and try to change politicians' minds and elect officials and get laws changed. And they just basically cause a whole lot of trouble for pro-lifers. So most recently, they went, if you typed in abortion clinic into Google, they claimed that 70-something%, I think it was 78% of the time, that a crisis pregnancy center advertisement would come up. And so they claimed that they went to Google and that they said, hey, these ads are deceptive because they show up with those search strings, because some of them were probably deceptive, like they were advertising as if they were an abortion clinic. And then you click on them and it's not. So I think that was a very small percentage of them, but they don't give exact numbers.
Right.
So that was the gist of it. So they claimed this major victory.
Right.
They said, we've gotten all these pro-life ads taken off of here. This is a major victory. They didn't give any solid numbers, though, I think is the key here.
Right.
And all of the organizations, like a lot of the major organizations, pro-life organizations that we've spoken with, have said it hasn't affected their advertising at all.
Right. Isn't that interesting how, the NARAL sent out this email to supporters saying, oh, big victory, we've gotten the majority of these removed.
Yeah.
But then, when we talk to groups like Heroic Media or Heartbeat International, they say, oh, this hasn't affected us at all.
Right.
So it's quite possible that maybe there were some smaller groups
Right.
that were advertising, oh, abortion, click here,
Exactly.
which was deceptive, and it is against Google's policies.
Exactly.
But we have no reason to think that this is some huge abortion victory. It
Right.
almost sounds like they're in a vulnerable position and they're trying to exaggerate, the victory. But
Exactly.
we got some statements from Heroic Media.
Yes.
That really sort of, I think, explain the situation.
Yeah, absolutely. Joe Young, the Vice President of Operations and Strategic Initiatives for Heroic Media, said the following. This represents the next round of NARAL's attacks on the work of grassroots organizations offering life-affirming alternatives to abortion. What do you think about how their tactic and how this is all going about?
Well, I think it's interesting that they don't give the details, they don't give the numbers, they don't give the specifics.
They said 2/3.
They said two-thirds, right? But
were-
2/3 of how many?
Right.
The way it was worded, they said, like 78 or 79% of these ads come up as pro-life groups, and then they said many of them are deceptive. We got 2/3 of the deceptive ones taken off, but they don't say how many.
So 2/3 of 2 out of 3, literally? Did they only submit 3 and 2 of them got taken down, or how many are we talking about?
The numbers are twisted so that
Right.
you would think that they got 2/3 of the 79%, but that's not actually, if
Right.
you go back and look at their statement, that's not what it says.
Yep.
And Joe Young, from Heroic Media, he also made an interesting point. He said, because abortion providers have a financial
Yes.
interest in a woman choosing abortion,
Right.
they often do not fully explain the risks and alternatives to abortion.
Right.
Heroic Media connects women with hopeful and healthy alternatives in their community. So if this is
Yep.
about making an informed choice, that's not what you're getting when you walk into an abortion clinic,
Exactly.
into a Planned Parenthood. And that's why there are groups like Heroic Media, which really tries to connect women. The goal there is to
Exactly.
connect women with the resources in different areas.
Absolutely.
And to advertise and help them see that there are options available.
And along those lines, this must be working. These advertisements must be working because Heartbeat International said that when an organization with the clout of NARAL sets its sights on a grassroots movement like ours and tries to strip a tool like Google out of our hands, we know we're onto something good. So
Exactly.
these things work. And so that's why NARAL is coming to attack this. But
I think so.
It seems like it hasn't been as successful as they claimed.
Right, right. Coming up after the break, we will hear from a moral theologian on the question of adopting embryos.
Stay tuned. Welcome back to Heroic Media. In case you're just joining us, I'm Patrick Cordova.
And I'm Michelle Bauman. In our next story, with in vitro fertilization being commonly used by infertile couples, questions are beginning to arise over what happens to the leftover frozen embryos. One author suggests that we as a society embrace the practice of embryo adoption. So, Patrick, for this story, I was actually able to interview Dr. E. Christian Bruegger, who is the Cardinal Stafford Moral Theology Professor at the St. John Vianney Theological Seminary in Denver. And he was
That's
able to
great.
give me some really good insight to this. So let's go ahead and take a look at what he said.
All right.
Dr. Bruegger, thank you so much for coming and spending a few minutes explaining this to me.
You're welcome, Michelle.
To give our viewers a little bit of background, we're talking about in vitro fertilization. So we're talking about taking the sperm and the egg outside of the man and woman and uniting them in a laboratory setting to create a new human life, and then implanting that human being, the new human embryo, inside of the woman's womb. And one of the complications of this is that due to the complexity of it and the expense of it and the low success rate, they will often take numerous egg and sperm and unite them to create numerous new human embryos, sometimes a dozen or more. So then there's this question of what do you do with these new human beings if that couple wasn't planning on having all of them? Many times they end up getting frozen. And so this one author had suggested that we increase embryo adoption, where another couple takes that embryo, implants them into this woman's womb, and that couple is able to have that baby develop in the womb and then give birth. So the question for us here is, where does the church stand on this? Does the church have a direct moral teaching about this?
It's a very, very good question. It's a critically important question because the problem of frozen embryos is not very well known, and hundreds of thousands of frozen embryos are presently are in suspended animation in IVF clinics around the country. So what do we do for these little brothers and sisters is a big question. Catholic theologians started to debate the question about 15 years ago, and debated it very hotly in the first decade of the 21st century, hoping that the Church would weigh in and give some authoritative judgment. In 2008, the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith published an instruction in which embryo adoption was the question of embryo adoption was raised, and the Church taught that it raises problematic questions because a woman is going to take an embryo that's not her own and have it transferred into her body. So it looks like IVF, even though it's not IVF. But the document didn't give an authoritative interpretation and judgment on the issue. So having read Dignitas Personae, one would not conclude yes or no as to whether this issue is just. So presently, as it stands, couples are left to their own discernment, the formation of their conscience, and then the judgments of themselves to decide whether to go forth with a procedure like this.
Okay, and when you say that the Church hasn't come out with a very clear yes or no, it just noted some of the problems, so that probably means that moral theologians might be divided, even if they're adhering to the magisterium, they're faithful and orthodox. There might be differing views, is that correct?
Yeah, one of the reasons that the magisterium didn't come out with an authoritative judgment is because the advisory committees that the CDF consulted were split on this issue. You have a group of moral theologians who are faithful to the magisterium who believe it's intrinsically immoral for a woman to gestate an embryo that's not her own. And then you have a whole other community of moral theologians who are faithful, like myself, who believe that it's not only morally illicit, but that it would even be praiseworthy to rescue an embryo and to provide it uterine nurture of this sort. So the community of moral theologians presently is split, and the Church hasn't given us an authoritative interpretation.
Okay, well, when we're talking about some of the problems that it raises that the Vatican noted and that some moral theologians actually think this is problematic, what are some of those problems?
Well, the two arguments on this against embryo adoption is that it violates, on the one hand, so these theologians say, the norm that requires human life only to be brought into existence in the context of marital love. And they attach pregnancy to procreation and therefore say pregnancy can't be pursued outside of marital intercourse. And clearly pregnancy is being pursued in embryo adoption outside of marital intercourse. Therefore, they say, it violates the norm against bringing human beings into life outside of marital intercourse. The second argument is that embryo adoption is kind of like a sexual act. A woman has an infusion into her body that causes her to be pregnant. But the only kind of infusion that a woman should ever have into her body that's impregnating should be her husband through marital intercourse. Therefore, it violates the sixth commandment of the Decalogue.
And then the other side of the view on this that says that this might not only be justifiable, but actually encouraged. What's the reasoning there?
Well, the reasoning is, look, whenever a new issue comes up, moral theologians have to ask, does this kind of act violate a norm that is already settled? So we shouldn't bring life into existence outside of marital intercourse. But a woman who adopts an embryo isn't bringing life into existence outside the context of marital intercourse. These lives are already brought into existence. They're full human lives at the embryonic stage of existence. So pregnancy here is not intrinsically related to marital intercourse. It's a different kind of act. And then the issue as to whether it violates a norm of sexual ethics, the reply to that is there's no sex involved. There's no intercourse going on in this issue. So it doesn't violate norms against human life, and it doesn't violate norms against sexual ethics, and therefore in itself is it justifiable? And we would argue, yes, it is justifiable, because you got hundreds of thousands of little human beings that only have one option, and that is uterine nurture. There's no other life-affirming option for them right now.
And just to be clear, we're talking about a very large number of human beings. It looks like, depending on what numbers you're looking at, between 500,000 and 1 million, somewhere in that range, human beings that are frozen in the embryonic state. So this isn't, some small group of people. This is a very big and real problem, and probably something that moral theologians will be continuing to talk about.
Absolutely. Absolutely. A million human beings is larger than the city of New Orleans before Hurricane Katrina. And the church teaches authoritatively that an embryo is a full human person with the full dignity of a human person. And so it's a really catastrophic problem that has to be dealt with. And so I'm very happy to see that you're addressing that in this program.
Yes, well, Dr. Brugger, thank you again so much for joining me and for sharing some of your insight.
You're welcome, Michelle.
Some really great comments there from Dr. Brugger. I'm glad he was able to give us his insight.
Yeah, that was really insightful. It never had dawned on me that we could be in such like this moral conundrum, like what do we do, where we're almost, it's rare that there's these situations, right? Most of the time, what we talk about, it's like very explicit. Yep, the Catholic Church teaches this, and you know, it's immoral to do these things. But in this case, there's not a clear teaching. We're still trying to figure out what the teaching is going to be.
I think it just shows that we've deviated so far from God's original plan for things that we get into these moral conundrums where we don't even know what's right and wrong anymore.
Yeah.
And if we just stick to the plan that God has for life and marriage and family, then we don't have to worry about any of this, you know?
Yeah, absolutely. And I wonder how long. I don't really know the church history on these types of issues, or it seems like more with science, you know, as science advances and makes these types of discoveries, that more of these moral types of issues are going to come about.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, the first test tube baby was born in the very end of the 70s. And so this is something that, and they didn't really start looking into it until this became a reality. And so, yeah, in some ways the church just has to respond to this.
Exactly. And so getting back to the history of things, I mean, I wonder how long it's going to take for the church to figure out this conundrum. And so it's just really, I don't know, it's an interesting topic, because we feel for these frozen embryos, which are human persons, and we want to help them out, but it's like, we don't know, you know, we have to just pray about it and really, you know, look in our hearts and see what we think is right. So. All right, coming up after the break, we'll share with you one last story about a pro-life victory in New York.
Stay tuned.
Welcome back to Heroic Media. In our final story, a New York Senate committee recently killed Governor Cuomo's radical abortion expansion bill, marking a victory for New Yorkers, especially the unborn. So, what did you think about this victory?
This was great, and this mirrors a victory earlier last year when a lot of these same provisions were tried to be pushed through.
Right.
When again it was defeated, and so it's really encouraging. New York has one of the highest abortion rates in the country, and it's really encouraging to see some of these pro-life victories.
Absolutely, and it was won on a party line vote, 9-7. There's a Republican-controlled state Senate there.
Right.
And so I think it's important, though, to remember too that these things aren't necessarily party line issues.
Right.
It's true that Republicans tend to be more pro-life than Democrats, but there are, of course, pro-abortion Republicans and pro-life Democrats.
Exactly. So if we look at what this measure was trying to do, it said that the claim was that this was just going to expand, or rather update New York law to match federal law. But if we look at what it was actually going to do, it was a radical expansion.
Yeah.
Absolutely. It was going to legalize some late-term abortions. It was going to require all hospitals to refer patients for abortion, or else they'll lose their funding. And it was going to allow non-doctors to perform abortions. That's the one that really got me.
Yeah, that got me too. How is that?
If you're concerned about the health and safety of women and you're lowering the medical standards for who can perform abortions, how is that a good idea?
Yeah, exactly. It's not. And that's one of the things that just got me too when I was reading through the details of the bill. I was like, you got to be kidding me. I was like, this seems a little excessive. You just want any old person, to be able to perform an abortion?
Right,
It seems like a pretty serious procedure.
It is, and you would think that, saying, oh, nurses or some other, licensed healthcare professional that isn't a doctor, that they would have to go through some kind of special training or something. And so I think anytime we're lowering the health or safety standards, that's not good for women, and that's not, as much as they can say this is a pro-woman bill, it's not.
Exactly. A lot of the supporters of the bill talk about said that this bill would guarantee a woman's right to control her reproductive health. So this is something that always comes up, it seems like, with these laws. And there's always this especially by pro-abortion groups, they come out and say, oh, this bill is great because it's going to guarantee a woman's right to control her own reproductive health. So how is it that this stance comes about? It's always baffling to me because it's like, okay, so now you don't have control over your reproductive health, but you will later? I mean, I don't think that's what it's really all about. It's just it's masquerading the issues.
I think anytime you hear the phrase reproductive health, you know, when we're talking about killing a child, that has nothing to do with reproductive health. It's a masking word. Of course, they don't want to talk about the baby. When you say, oh, what's aborted? Oh, it was a clump of tissues. It was fetal matter. They'll say anything but an unborn baby, which is when you look at a pregnant woman and, oh, I'm so, you know, congratulations, you're expecting a baby. It's very clear, you know, it's very clear this is twisting words. And, you know, as I said, they tried to push this through as part of a larger women's equality agenda last year, and it failed. And it failed. It had been going through, there was a lot of expectation that it was going to pass, but the local Catholic Church really stepped up and opposed it. Cardinal Dolan really led the charge. And I think we've seen several times now some of these grassroots Catholic efforts where the people really get involved to oppose something, and they're able to stop the legislature from trying to push something through that the people don't even want. Yep,
exactly. And I think that those grassroots, you know, people coming together like that is really going to be key, because what those opposing lawmakers need to see is that we are against this, right? We oppose this, and they need to know without a doubt. And I think recently you mentioned, you know, in Colorado there was an issue where there was a grassroots movement, pro-life issue. Grassroots came up and really just totally stopped the bill because everybody was pretty scared that it was going to pass.
Right, absolutely.
And so I think that that's really key. And another thing, we talk about, pro-abortion people often talk about this fundamental right. So what do you think? They talk about this is a fundamental right to have an abortion, a woman's right. So what do you think about that, coming from a woman's perspective?
I think when I look at fundamental rights are things that we possess. We possess life, we possess liberty, we possess freedom, we possess all these different things. And once we go out and try to define all these other fundamental rights, I think you have to look at where are they actually coming from. What is the fundamental right to an abortion? The right to terminate a pregnancy, the right to end the life of a human being who is developing in your womb. Where did we get those rights? You know, we look at life, liberty, those are innate within us. They come from God.
I'm just joking.
Right, that's the thing. Where does this right come? Where does the right to kill your child come from? It doesn't. You know, it's just the false language, the same thing we've been talking about.
Absolutely. All right, that's it for this week on Heroic Media. Please join us next week for all the up-to-date news on the pro-life issues that matter to you.
Please feel free to write to us with any comments, questions, or news tips at news@heroicmedia.org.
And please visit our website at heroicmedianews.org, where you can read more stories like the ones we discuss on this show.
That's it for this time. Until next week, please keep us in your prayers.
God bless.